Welcome to the I Now Pronounce You Divorced podcast, where we have three award-winning family law attorneys dive into intriguing topics like divorce, military divorce, custody and visitation, trust and estate planning, and all things family law. Join us as we provide a comprehensive viewpoint through the eyes of our experts and guests, aiming to educate and soothe our listeners. Get ready to tune in because I Now Pronounce You Divorced starts right now.
Hi, I'm Charles Hatley, and welcome back to I Now Pronounce You Divorce. Today is part two of what Dan and I were talking about last week, which was high net worth divorces. And where we stopped last week was really talking about that line of being able to preserve the assets that you want to preserve, but never crossing the line of trying to take some illegal steps to hide assets. This week, what we're going to be talking about a little bit more is athletes and high net worth divorces and pre and post nuptial agreements. But before we do, I wanted to, we ran out of time last week, but I wanted to tell one of the best stories I ever read about hiding assets. And it was this guy in Australia who had an international company and overpaid his US taxes by like $100 million. And so he sends $100 million to like the United States IRS. They get this huge check. He then goes into the divorce minus this $100 million. And so he goes through the divorce, gets divorced, minus this $100 million. After the divorce, files his taxes properly, gets his money back from the IRS. And I was like, what a ingenious way to do it, except he got caught. And I always laughed about, man, the guy he overpaid the IRS to not get caught. Um, but there are some very creative people out there. This week, I kind of want to jump into professional athletes, right? You know, Dan, we have offices in the DC area, the Charlotte area, the Tampa area, and we represent professional athletes as well. And when you're talking about, you know, these huge multi-million-dollar contracts and everything else that goes along with the professional athlete, sometimes the other side just gets stuck with dollar signs. And I'm not even talking about maybe the spouse, but even some of the attorneys that represent the other side just see huge dollar signs, not realizing that these athletes have had to pay a myriad of people in order to get that, and they pay taxes in every state they play in. So how do you right set expectations in a situation like that?
I'll answer it in two ways. One, from the spouse that's married to the athlete. It's really look if they have an idea of what that contract is, and hopefully they have a copy of it. Then that makes life a lot easier for me.
Mm.
But usually that's not the case. I have to get it through discovery, as we were talking about in the other episode. It's really just kind of breaking it down to where they may be getting X dollars, but that doesn't mean it's all up front. And to your point, you hear it on the news and you read it that they're getting, I think few years ago, Patrick Mahomes got like a $500 million contract, but how is that structured, right? That doesn't mean he's getting $500 million in his pocket today. I mean, to your point, there's a lot of people involved in that that's going to get a percentage of that. And that's going to take away quite a hunk of it. But then it's, what are you getting in year one? What are you getting in year two? And then you also want to look at not just a breakdown, but what are the incentives too? Because most athletes have a yearly salary, we'll call it, right, for their contract. But if they hit a certain performance metric, as in most companies, there's a bonus. So if a football player gets, more than X number of yards or more than X number of touchdowns or where the case may be, then there's subject to an additional bonus payout. And that's why I always like watching Sigmund NFL, kind of the last game. You see certain players get more attention because the quarterback's trying to get them to be able to meet their bonus. And it's the same thing in every sport. You just want to know, what are those metrics? Because that's money that you don't want to really leave out on the table. But then on the other side, when we have represented athletes, it's what is this contract? Is it your rookie contract? What does it look like outside of the rookie contract? And how long is that for? And then what are you looking at as potential payout? Because if you're having issues now, we kind of want to look bigger picture down the road. What does that look like? I was just thinking of, again, our business blueprint episode where we're talking about the three hag and building out for the next 3 years. What does that plan look like? Well, here it's okay. What does it look like in the contract? When are you getting paid the most? Because if you're not happy and you think there's a potential for separation, divorce, maybe now is unfortunately the most opportune time from your perspective to be able to mitigate that. Because if you continue to stay married, then that marital component just continues to essentially compound, and your spouse is getting a significant more interest in whether it's a bonus payout or if there is that disparity in income, which most likely there is when you're talking about an athletic contract that's usually in the millions of dollars, if not tens of millions. But even on a lower end, someone who's just kind of breaking in, whether it's the minor leagues or whatever it may be, that's similar for other sports, you're still talking significant money. And then the other side to that is going to be having those conversations dealing with custody, because to your point, you're paying taxes in a lot of different states to where you travel. And I didn't, quite frankly, I didn't realize that until I started representing athletes and looking through the taxes and thinking, what the heck? And then it's like, oh my gosh, that stinks, because you think that, you get X number of dollars for the team you play for, but there's all these other states that you've traveled to that you may have to pay taxes in. And that's why some athletic players like to live in certain parts of the country, or some don't like to play in certain parts because there's, that tax component to it. But then you got to look at from the custody side too. How often are you traveling? What does that look like? And that's going to affect child support. And so I like to just kind of have those open and frank discussions with clients, either side, if you're the recipient or the person that's the higher income, kind of bigger picture, what does it look like? Because then you want to make sure in the off season that you are able to spend time with the kids, and to make sure that you're getting that makeup time, that in other divorces, even if they're high net worth, you may not be traveling, you could be the CEO of a company, but you have that high net worth value, or making that significant income. But we want the athletes to be able to benefit from when they're in town, that they can have structured parenting plans. And on the, I think it was a couple episodes before this one, we're talking about pitfalls of parenting plans, and what to look out for, and the language to include, and to be very detailed. And with athletes, it's no different. And I always, when I'm speaking with athletes, kind of analogize it to being in the military. If you're called to go out on duty, when you come back, you want to have that makeup time. Just like being an athlete, when you're on the road traveling, you want to make sure you have that makeup time. But it's making sure that you have the full picture of what their financial assets are, and really digging into the taxes to see, okay, you may, in the media it says X dollars, but when you really break it down, it's Y dollars per year. And that's what we need to focus on.
Yeah, and right, setting those expectations with opposing counsel sometimes becomes impossible. And a lot of people don't realize professional athletes have pensions. And I've been in a few cases. I don't want to say, oh, I've been in so many cases, but a few cases where the other side didn't even think about, our client having a pension. And one of the biggest mistakes that I see our professional athlete clients making is they're too willing to give away everything just to move on, because they want to get back to focusing on their sport, focusing on their career. And we've had people walk in that, they've signed these ridiculous spousal support agreements that are non-modifiable. And I'm like, what happens if you get hurt? You're done, right? You read the terms of your contract, you get hurt, you're done. You can't afford to pay this person $25,000, $30,000 a month anymore, but you're still on the hook. And we, fortunately, I got the other side to renegotiate that term, only because the soon-to-be ex-wife was pretty nice. She was actually being pretty nice about it. And another thing that's creeping into professional athlete divorces is something that wasn't there before: premarital income. And what you think of, there's a lot of our professional athlete clients. They've met somebody, they were with them when they got that initial contract, and they got married shortly thereafter. So most of their assets are marital. But now we're talking about these name, image, and likeness deals, these NIL deals that these players are getting in college, that are going north of $1 million a year or season. And now they're walking out of college multimillionaires. And so there is significant premarital interest there that I think is something that anybody who represents professional athletes is really going to have to start digging into, because not almost all, an extreme number of athletes right now are getting NIL deals that are going to be set up as premarital income, which leads me to my next topic. Prenuptial and postnuptial agreements. So can you kind of explain to us what a prenuptial and postnuptial agreement is?
Sure. Very high level, prenuptial means before the marriage, and postnuptial means after the marriage. And in both documents, you have to have consent of the other party, meaning that they need to read it, they need to agree to it, and they need to sign it. But where I find there's two components that I find really, we'll say, trips people up or gets them in trouble in trying to enforce them would be one, that there's no full disclosure. And then two, not having language in there that you highly encourage and even suggest that the other side retain counsel and have them review and then sign off on it. And I guess I'll add a third component, that the timing of it, right? Because if you have a premarital agreement and you go through steps 1 and 2 that I just went through, but then you present it to your spouse and the next year you're getting married, that may not be as enforceable. Or if you're already married and then you present it and then you file for divorce, right? So you want to make sure that the timing makes sense to where it doesn't come across in the court's eyes that you're trying to be deceptive or deceitful to the court, or trying to mislead the court or mislead your spouse. But on the premarital, so before the marriage, it's you want to really identify all of the assets and the debt that you have before you get married, and have an agreement that those assets are yours. And you want to make sure that you're dealing with the growth of it too. That's another kind of pitfall that I see, where you may have a retirement account and it's worth, $100,000, and then that's mine. But you really want to have language that says that not only do I have this account and it's worth $100,000, say, but any growth to that is going to remain premarital. And a lot of attorneys just don't put that language in there for one reason or another, and maybe because they just overlook it. To your example earlier in the painting issue, when you submitted that it was licensed, and they just probably read the document, didn't really think anything of it. And that's where asking questions really comes into play and taking those depositions. But on the premarital asset side, we just want to make sure that we have that open disclosure. And then there's the duty of continuing updated too. I always advise clients, just review it every year. Make it a New Year's resolution, right? You want to just update it if there's anything that needs to be updated. One thing you cannot put in a premarital agreement would be anything restricting custody. That would be considered invalid, and potentially it may invalidate the entire agreement. So you want to make sure that there's nothing that would be restrictive on custody. Even if the other side agrees to it, it most likely could be held unenforceable or even an avoidable contract. So that's another pitfall. On the post-nuptial side, so nuptials mean the marriage, it's basically the same as how I explained the client, except the only difference is now you're married, but you still want to fully disclose the assets. You still want to make sure the other side understands it. You still want to make sure that they have ample opportunity and time to be able to hire an attorney to advise them. And then they can sign it. And then if there's issues down the road, I wouldn't suggest filing for divorce right after. It's, always the attorney answer. Okay, well, Dan, what would you suggest would be a good time? Well, it depends. Right. I mean, if something could happen that's out of your control afterwards that you didn't foresee, and that way you weren't really trying to be deceptive, but you also want to make sure that it's not, again, the next day or even really, quite frankly, 6 months to a year afterwards. But it's just, again, that continuing duty of updating that post-nuptial agreement.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And you brought up a wonderful point about the prenuptial agreement. Don't do it the day of the wedding. Don't do it the day before the wedding. When I've been working with any client, if they can afford it, I say get the other attorney for your spouse.
Yeah.
You pay for it, and it really shouldn't cost that much. But especially when I'm dealing with high net worth clients, I say, look, let's get this done, and let's pay for an attorney from the other side. Let me and the other attorney sit down, have a conversation, and then also put this representation agreement from both attorneys in an envelope with your prenuptial agreement, just so you remember the other firm. Post-nuptial agreements always, they liken back to the story I had. We had a client, she made a ton of money, and her husband was a stay-at-home alcoholic who enjoyed physical violence, and she enjoyed him. And so after a particularly rough night, she comes in and says, look, I need a post-nuptial agreement. You're like, how do you not want a divorce? I don't get it, but it's not my business. And so she goes and we write a post-nuptial agreement. It's everything that she wants. She comes back like 2 days later and the thing is just signed, right? He waives all spousal support. He does this, he does that, he does this, he does that. And I really didn't think much about it. I was like, why did he sign it? I said, in what world would this guy sign this? And she goes, well, I told him that I wouldn't prosecute him for the latest time he beat me. And I said, well, hopefully you didn't put that in writing. I said, that's all I have to say. Like, just don't put that in writing. But that would be very suspect, like you were talking about. She utilized a bad point in time to elicit him to sign this document. And that could be seen as very coercive by the court and end up in a postnuptial agreement. And we talked to her about it all through it. And she's like, hey, look, I understand the risk. After she came back with it. And I just had to ask, right? Sometimes we shouldn't be so curious, but I just had to know. She understood the risk, but the courts can invalidate these documents. And the problem that we run into in high net worth divorces is the other side's risk versus reward is so great on the reward side, they have to try to invalidate the document, right? Have you run into that where you have a fairly solid prenuptial agreement or postnuptial agreement, but there's just so much at play that you have to talk to your client and say, look, man, we have to understand why they're trying.
Oh yeah, all the time. And it's just having those frank discussions with the client to where does the benefit outweigh the reward or the risk, depending upon which side you're arguing or presenting on. But those are tough conversations because the clients enter into it in good faith, and then come time for a divorce, now one of the sides is trying to invalidate it, and it's, well, wait a second, you're kind of changing the rules of the game here, and then you start kind of poking holes into the postnuptial or prenuptial agreement, and the other side gets upset, and then that sometimes can prevent really good fruitful discussions on settlement happening because the other side thinks that, well, now they're negotiating in bad faith here, or what was happening down at the time of the pre or the postnuptial, they were thinking down the road, this is what I was going to be trying to do the whole time. So it does really thwart a lot of benefit to the court process, I feel, and sometimes can maybe cause undue delay. But at the end of the day, it depending upon what they're trying to do, if they're trying to invalidate it or validate it, if it's in good faith in the sense that they truly believe that it should be upheld and not just to try to stick it to the side, or the other side really feels, yeah, well, we agreed to it at a certain point in time, but now it's invalidated because of certain things that have happened. And there's uh, causes and effects that you can put into these pre or post-nuptial agreements too, to work kind of an if this happens, then this happens type deal. And that's really kind of going towards the marital conduct type. And then those are some things, to your point on some of the uh, things not to sign on is I never advise clients, you don't want to put in these agreements that if you have an affair, then an X more dollars is going to go to your spouse. Not saying that you would have it, but you never know what happens in life. And these things that are these agreements that come in that are non-modifiable, those in my experience usually are detrimental because to your point, unless the other side is going to agree to amend it, there's no incentive for them to do that. And it's just those are the toughest conversations because you think at one point in your life, oh yeah, that makes sense. Let's just do it non-modifiable. I don't care. But life happens and you may not be in that same position, or even you don't think, down the road, depending upon when the divorce is happening, that you're going to retire. And so you want to have that taken into consideration too. The courts don't care. The court's going to say, listen, you were of sound mind. You were represented by an attorney if you were, and you signed this document and you didn't contest it. So this is a valid contract. I'm going to uphold it and enforce it. Now, the question then becomes, you may not be able to comply with this, so are you in contempt? And I know we talked on several episodes, we probably can talk more about it in a whole new episode, but do you have the ability to comply? And that's kind of where it gets a little bit gray, to whereas you may not be held in contempt, but you still have this compounded interest that's being added on, and you still owe this money. And then if you are a high asset client, then you have all these assets that are worth a lot of money that you could be liens could be attached to, or you could be forced to sell some of these to be able to comply with the agreement. So there's those other pitfalls that I just try to bring up to clients as we try to navigate some of these pre and post nuptial agreements.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite stories about a postnuptial agreement was I worked with a client, a high net worth client, gave him the advice. I said, hey, go and hire your wife an attorney, have me and the attorney sit down and negotiate this. And he did, and we did. And I gave him the advice, take the representation agreement, put it in the envelope. And I also printed out every email exchange between the other attorney and I said, hey, there's just everything you need. About 5 years later, we're going through the divorce. We get a complaint about this postnuptial agreement that it has to be invalidated because it's the most inequitable thing ever written. Nobody in their right mind would ever agree to it. It was just horribly drafted. And they knew I had drafted it, so they were really attacking me. They didn't realize that it was a partner at the firm had reviewed it and had put edits in it and agreed to the drafting. I had all the emails. It was some other attorney. So I let them put these bombastic claims, and my client he was human. He's like, how do you sit back and just take these insults? And I was like, just wait and see. So my response motion was all the edits from that law firm going back and forth and them saying they're agreeing. Then we got attorneys' fees and sanctions. And that's another lesson. A lot of practitioners, when they come into these high net worth divorces, fire off these bombastic attacks on wonderfully drafted documents, and they feel like they have to fire off these bombastic attacks because that's how they're going to catch the attention of the other side. Be careful somebody in your firm didn't write it. It is a cautionary tale. Double check to make sure somebody else didn't draft it as well. But Dan, I want to thank you for taking time to talk to me today about high net worth divorces and really getting into the athletic side of it. The athletic side with the NIL deals coming out, I think is going to be a new world for athletes who unfortunately go through the divorce process. If you like this episode, please click like or subscribe. And if you know somebody who is going through the divorce process, give Malone Hatley PC a call and see the difference that a partner can truly make for you.
Thank you for tuning in to our podcast. If you found this episode helpful and you want more informational content, please be sure to subscribe and join us on all major social media platforms, including YouTube. Stay connected for more exciting updates and tips.